So I'm going to call this meeting of the Rhode Island Marine Fisheries Council to order. My name is Bob Ballou, Assistant to the Director at DEM. I serve as Chair of the Council on behalf of DEM Director Coit. With us tonight as members of the Council are Chris Ryan, Katie Egan, Andy D'Angelo, Travis Barrow, Jason Jarvis, and Dave Monty. We have an agenda before us tonight. Do any members of the council have any recommended changes to the agenda? If so, please raise your hand or just speak out. Seeing no hands and hearing none, no voices, I will consider the agenda approved by consent, and we're on to item 2 on the agenda, which are the meeting minutes from the last meeting of the council held on December 7th, 2020. Does any member of the council have any recommended changes to those meeting minutes? I'm flipping through to see if I see any hands or indications. I see none. So with that, is there any objection to approving the minutes as drafted? Seeing no objection, the minutes stand approved by consent. And we're on to item 3, which is public comment. This is an opportunity for anyone participating in tonight's council meeting from the public who would like to address the council on any item that is not on tonight's agenda to do so. Would any member of the public like to address the council at this point on any issue that's not on tonight's agenda? If so, please raise your hand or just speak out. We'll do our best to recognize you. We'll give you a few seconds here. Bob, we have one hand raised. John, can you?
Yep, Bob, I've asked you to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, Bob, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a Tautog proposal. I believe some of you may have that. And you can read that and discuss that if it's possible, whatever time that you find appropriate to fit that in.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, we will take that up when we get to, I believe it's commercial Tautog, which is on tonight's agenda under item 7. So thank you for that submission, and we will be addressing that matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other members of the public who would like to address the council on any item not on tonight's agenda? Seeing none, and again, I trust most folks are familiar now with Zoom, but there are ways that you can raise your hand. There's a process down below, I'm sorry, a way to do that at the bottom of your screen. But if you're unfamiliar with that, just feel free to raise your hand or just speak out. We have a relatively small group tonight, and I'll do my best to accommodate everyone as appropriate. So with that, we'll move on to the next item on tonight's agenda, which is item 4, Napatree Point. I believe Connor McManus has a brief update for the council on that issue. Connor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just briefly, this is strictly for informational purposes only. I believe it was last Monday or 2 ago, we had a workshop meeting regarding Napatree Point in the context of of the marine life management area efficacy there in waters around Little Narragansett Bay, Sandy Point, and on the ocean facing side of the point. At that discussion, we focused on constructing an area to try and meet ecosystem-based management goals for the area and habitat protection and horseshoe crabs, particularly in habitat, particularly eelgrass and blue mussels. There was a lot of feedback that was provided by various members of industry and council members, of which we listened to, and the primary purpose for bringing it up for tonight's meeting specifically is that in a subsequent council meeting that would then normally have this go out to notice and discussion there, the Napatree Point Marine Life Management Area for this time being will not be pushed forward through the regulatory cycle. We are working internally towards a number of aspects, such as collaboration with our partners in Connecticut, improving enforcement of the area to have better enforcement of certain regulations down there, particularly for horseshoe crabs, to address some of industry's concerns about illegal poaching, particularly from Connecticut harvesters, and try and address a more collaborative approach between scientists, managers, non-government organizational scientists, and industry towards working on monitoring and evaluating data that allows us to collectively work towards these goals for the area as we all see fit. Specifically, we're working on a state-specific horseshoe crab stock assessment that will be available to us later in the year for discussion in the context of both the Rhode Island's horseshoe crabs as well as that for Napatree, and additional research looking at the stock structure for horseshoe crabs in Rhode Island and trying to better understand the value of various areas such as Napatree. So while you won't see this in a public hearing or a public notice or council meeting in the near future, we will likely reevaluate this tool later, maybe at the end of this year, if not sooner than that, but in conjunction with those who came to express their thoughts on the marine life management area at our last meeting. So for those that came, you'll likely be hearing from me on just trying to set up a meeting to get your thoughts and how we can best address those, as well as share information with you on more of the science that we have for this area and trying to better highlight to you our reasons for why we believe this area would benefit from some of the proposals that we have and where we collectively need to move forward in terms of getting better information. So I'm happy to take any questions, but the long story short is that you won't be seeing this MLMA come through public notice or a public hearing this spring.
Thanks, Connor. And before I seek any comment or questions from the council, Nicole, if you don't mind, can you just pull down the screen share for just a bit? We'll probably want to get back to that very soon, but it might be easier to have us all up if possible. Thank you. I think that helps a lot for at least a certain number of these agenda items. So with that, we now see Connor, and if any member, does any member of the council have any questions for Connor based on his brief report out on the Napatree issue?
I will note too that if you would rather chat with me offline, that's fine as well. But I'll reach out to you for those interested in this topic and those who have expressed strong feelings about this topic in the near future. Great,
thanks. Very good. So with that, we will move on to our next agenda item, which is item 5, and that is the Shellfish Advisory Panel meeting minutes from the panel's meeting that was held on December 16th, 2020. Katie Egan chairs the SAP for the council. And Katie, if you don't mind, I would suggest maybe just briefly reporting out on there were 2 or 3 items in that report. Hold the Pinheiro portion of that to the end so that we can sort of move right into that as our next agenda item. So the floor is yours, Katie, to speak to any of the issues from that SAP meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. We had 2 aquaculture applications. One was in Portsmouth, and the panel voted unanimously to that it was consistent with competing uses engaged in the exploitation of marine fisheries. So they were in support of that. They're followed by the Pinheiro application, which we'll discuss later. Then we had a discussion on the panel's involvement in the preliminary determination process. So now the panel members will have more input in the preliminary determination stage of the application. That way the applicant has more, has just a broader information to go with before submitting their full application. And hopefully this will clear up some of the issues that we're having with the Shellfish Advisory Panel and in the applications. And then we wrapped it up with a quick discussion on the Providence River and going forward with that opening and further meetings. All of the minutes in our packet accurately reflect the meeting. So if anybody has any questions.
Any questions for Katie? and again, I'm going to ask her to tee up the Pinheiro application in a minute, but I just wanted to see if there were any questions for her on any of those other items. And I will say I appreciate what seemed like a very healthy discussion on the CRMC process, and want to thank Ben Getch for his involvement in working with the SAP to try to, make it an improved process, which sounds like is in the works. So with particular focus on that PD stage. So thank you, Ben, for bringing that forward, and thanks, Katie, for engaging in that discussion. What I'll do now is we should, well, let me just see, is there any objection to accepting and placing on file the SAP meeting minutes? Seeing no objection, they're accepted and will be placed on file by consent. And what I'd like to do now is move on to item 6, which is the aquaculture lease application review for Antonio and Joseph Pinheiro. And I'd like to begin with the SAP review of that application, which is in those meeting minutes. But I'll go back to Katie now to just summarize the SAP's review of that application.
Sure. So the panel ultimately voted they voted sorry, let me get this up here. That they voted that the application is not consistent with competing uses engaged in the exploitation of marine resources. 7 voted for the motion with 1 abstention. So the concern was the high density of quahogs found in the area, and that would the density that was found at this particular site is one of the highest that's ever been reported for any application. And the concern was that this could be a viable resource, that it would interfere with people's ability to fish in the area, and that this would set a precedent for future applicants going forward. So while there isn't, I'm sure Ben can expand on this, but while there isn't a threshold for the amount of shellfish found in the area, this is a high number that is of concern for the fishermen. They want to, they didn't feel comfortable approving this. So.
Thank you for that. I'd next like to give the applicants an opportunity to address the council, particularly in regard to the concerns expressed by the Shellfish Advisory Panel. I believe we have both applicants in attendance, Antonio and Joseph Pinheiro. Would either one of you like to address the council? If so, John, can you just facilitate that? Let's see, do we have them? I thought I saw their name. I see Antonio.
I've unmuted them.
Okay, you're both unmuted. If either one of you would like to speak, you're welcome to.
Okay, I guess I'll start. I know Joe has some stuff to say anyways, but we're applying for a half-acre site. And I have a question on the method that was used to get the findings on the density. I believe that the method was used for the half-acre site. There'll be the same method that is used for, say, 10 acres. And the same amount of area is covered. And I don't believe that that's a fair estimate of what we actually have there. If you compare that, say, for instance, they just approved a site, the Coastal Resources just approved a site that was 8 acres and the same amount of area, I believe, was, if I'm wrong, correct me, was used for the 8 acres, and only, it doesn't make sense to me that you would actually dig the same amount of area for a half acre that you would for 8 acres. It just doesn't, I can't compute that. I'm an old man, I don't know what the, I mean, I did good in math, but I understand that if you're going to bull rake in an 8 acre area and you're going to dig out 5 spots and then go into a half acre area, and which actually, correct me again if I'm wrong, I believe he dug in 40 different areas, maybe smaller poles, but I don't believe the density is what is actually being reported. And also, we have 2 acres there already that have already been tested before we got the application, before we got our first site. The 2 acres that we have, and the density was within the limits. So I don't know if this ½ acre should apply to 2.5 acres, which would put us way below. And like I said, that's my 2 questions anyways. I may have more in the future, but I'll pass it on to Joe.
Thank you, Antonio. Joe, would you like to add to that?
Hi, yeah, this is Joseph Pinheiro. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a few things I'd like to say. So I had a 6.4 call hog per square meter density. I like what Katie said about there's no threshold for the amount of call hogs in a spot. The shellfish panel, they made it really clear, people that talk, that this wasn't a really good spot for commercial digging. It's on a slope there. There's not a lot of tide. It's a really hard bottom. It's rocky. Ben Getch admitted too that it wasn't really a good spot to commercial rake. So if you add in all those factors, it's really not a good spot to commercial rake. We really didn't get any objections on this at all from recreational diggers. We had testimony at the shellfish panel from a member that the recreational diggers probably do appreciate what we're trying to do here. We're trying to plant some call hogs, soft shell clams, oysters. It's going to help restore the area. And as far as this being a high density for an area, it's a very small area. It's only a ½ acre. You found 30 call hogs, 32 call hogs. If you kind of compare this to what's going on already in the state, if you compare this to like a 2 acre site, just like the same shellfish meeting where we were at, there was a guy with he went for a 2 acre site, and part of his lease was muddy, and then along the edges of his lease he had a harder bottom, so he had a higher concentration around the edge of his lease of call hogs, and then in the soft mud there wasn't a very high concentration at all. So basically, just like we're doing here, if you expand our lease that we have now and you calculate the average for the whole lease, 2.5 acres, you'd be under 2 call hogs per square meter. So basically, it's not a very high density, because if we were to apply for more acreage, then the density would go down drastically. It's just because we have like one little strip of call hogs in the lease there that it looks like it's a high density, but like I said, it's only a ½ acre, so the density really isn't high. Like I said, if all you got to do is just average the farm that we have there now, and you'll see that the density between the 2.5 acres is only it's under 2 per square meter. And like I said, you guys, the shellfish panel just approved a 2 acre site that had a density of 2 call hogs a square meter. So if you can kind of understand where I'm going with that, that's kind of the point that I would like to make you guys to consider. And I'm also here for questions too. So
Yeah, no, we appreciate that, and thank you so much. Let me see if I can circle back to the questions that Antonio raised, and I'm not sure I have them both squared away. I think one had to do with the methodology used to determine the cohog density. I'm not sure if Ben Getch is prepared to address that, or perhaps Anna Gerber. I'm not sure who actually conducted the survey and whether it followed standard protocols. Ben, are you able to address that issue?
Sure. Yeah. Our standard way of surveying for an area that is deeper than, say, wading depth is, to use our boat. We use our, Carolina skiff or our survey vessel, and we use tongs. to take a number of bottom samples, and based on the number of tongs, pulls you take, you can figure out how many square meters you've covered, and so then you know what your findings were, and you can divide that by the square meters that you've covered and come up with your average. For this particular site, it is so close to shore and shallow, we wouldn't have been able to do use our standard equipment. So I used a recreational, rib brake, and I did transects from the shore to the existing boundary of the lease, and that's represented there in that graphic with the numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, each indicating a transect. So I didn't drag the rake the entire time across that line, but what I did was similar to how we would use the tongs in a way, in that I figured out that using the basket dimensions I had, that about 8 pulls of that rake would cover a square meter. And I determined, this by kind of doing some experiments on the sand and later at my office. And when you're using a recreational rake, you're working backwards. So taking one, kind of standard step back and pulling the rake along, that's how I calculated the length of the area. And then of course I knew the width of it because I knew the width of the basket. And I would say that I was surprised to find the 32 clams I found, with, I think, including in those 32 were 3 that were small enough to fit through the bars on my recreational rake. So there were some smaller oysters mixed in, but also tops and cherries. It was very hit or miss. There were a couple times along a transect where I'd be pulling a rake, nothing, and pull the rake, nothing, and then I'd get like 3 or 4 in a pull. So there's clearly an area, maybe it corresponds to something in the contour line, in the slope of the shore there, where there's a higher density of quahogs, and it really did throw off these numbers. I mean, made them fairly high. So, the methodology here was adapted for the situation with the gear I had on hand. I did find quahogs, and I was as surprised as the applicant, but that is the situation we have here.
Thank you for that, Ben. Antonio, I know you said you had 2 questions. I believe that was 1. Can you remind me what your other question was?
Oh, well, good question there. I got a question just on that, what Ben just said, and then hopefully I can get back to the second question. The same methodology, it might have been the second question, which is to use the same methodology used for 10 acres as it is for a half acre. But as Ben just stated, he pulled that rake 40 times on a half acre. If you went at high tide, you could tong. I've tonged. I'm old enough. You go at high tide if you're going to go in shallow water, and you could tong and do the same exact thing that you did on the 10 acres. That was the question. How many times would you pull? How many times would you tong in the 10 acres? The same amount as a half acre. It doesn't make sense that you would take 8 acres that was just approved. I don't even know what, it was even moved. I don't know if it was double checked when it was moved, but I don't feel that it's fair if you're going to pull it. The question is that the same methodology used on any other farm? And how many times was the tong put down there? 5 different locations? I don't know how many locations.
When we go tonging, it's 4 pulls of the tong for a square meter, and we cover a minimum of 5 different square meter stations, as we call. We kind of position the boat in one area and maybe drift slowly and do 5 pulls in that area, or sorry, 4 pulls in that area to be a square meter. But if for a larger site, we end up covering many more square meters just to get a representative sample and kind of know where things lay on the on the area.
But the normal methodology would be to cover the same amount of square
No, like I said, if it was an 8-acre site, we would cover more than just 5 square meters.
Right.
I don't
on one
know how
pole.
many we did on that. One pole is 1/4 of a square meter. So if we were talking 5 square meters here, that would be at least 20 poles with a rake.
All right, so 20 and 10 acres and 40 and a half acre. That answered my question. Thank you.
But they cover different areas, and like I said, we would do more.
It's
than
still a
5.
big area though, Ben. It's not. I think you're talking about 8 acres. That's my whole neighborhood. That's a couple of blocks in my neighborhood, actually. You know, and houses are pretty spread out here. Where a half acre is what I own, and if you pull it 40 times, you know, if I'm digging for worms and I dig 40 holes, I'm going to find more worms in my little lot than I'm going to, you know, if I pull 20 in the whole neighborhood. I mean, you know, to me, it doesn't make sense. And when what we're doing, we're planting directly on the bottom here, and there's not a lot of coal hogs there. Believe me, I'm a commercial digger. My son's been a commercial digger. If there were coal hogs there, we would have dug them out a long time ago. I've been working this area for 45 years. You know, it's just not even close to what, you know, nobody's going to make a living on the goddamn thing, you know. And what we're doing there, we're planting millions of product, you know, for 32 coal hogs and 40 poles. I don't think it's fair that we get knocked off when these, if you look at the whole map that you had on earlier, there's, you know, 30 acres there now, or whatever is being introduced is going to be up to close to 30 acres there. And we're trying to do a new type of, you know, not a new, but old, where the oysters grow and what we can do. And we're not using up 10 acres in the bay, putting in 2,000 cages and, you know, what everybody else is doing. Some guys are putting in 12,000 cages. We're trying to do what they're doing on this small little piece of property. You know, I don't think it's fair that, you know, with this density thing, you know, this is showing us the density on here is telling you guys that we have more coal hogs in Greenwich Bay that is transplanted. You know, it just doesn't make sense to me. And anybody that, you know, I'm hoping anyways, you know, it's just, you know, that the methodology to it, it's just, I don't believe it's even close to, you know, showing what's actually on this little half-acre site that we know well. You know, there was nothing there before we got there. We're putting cages in and everything else, and it's actually creating an environment, you know. So you found 32 out of 40. It just doesn't, the math doesn't add up to me.
Well, thank you for that. What I'd like to do is let's expand the screen so that we have all of our faces, those of us who are videoed in on. Now I'd like to go to the council for questions, comments. I see Dave Monte's hand up. Dave?
Thank you, Bob. This is for the division question. This type of research, can someone make me feel more comfortable about it? As it was described, it seemed a little sketchy, to be honest with you. And as a recreational quail hogger, what many Rhode Islanders have been all their lives, I thrive to find, I exist to find my spots where there are honey spots, and you keep going back to those spots. And then all around it, there may be no quail hogs at all. So it's such a small area. I'm wondering if, yeah, that could be one spot, but as the gentleman pointed out, if you surveyed 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 acres, how many quail hogs would be per square meter? So I'm a little concerned about the science in that regard.
And it sounded like you wanted the division to respond. I'm thinking that might be Anna Gerber. Was that your intent, Dave, to ask DEM staff to respond? I think I'm going to assume that's what you intended to address that question to DEM staff, and I'm wondering if Anna, you would be willing to address that.
Yes, hi everyone. This is Anna Gerber-Williams from the Division of Marine Fisheries, and I'd like to say that we are in agreement with Ben's survey methods from what he described to me and other staff members, he went out there and did a stratified random sampling of that particular area. And the proportion of the area that was sampled is appropriate in comparison to a larger lease that would have been assessed for the same type of measurements. So, you know, the results make it look like there's this very high density throughout, but it's probably representing more a very patchy high distribution. And our concern is the fact that there is these areas of patchiness, and it seems to be a good environment for cohogs and cohog seed. So in that sense, we're in agreement that if we're finding these kinds of high patchy densities in this kind of substrate, this cobbly substrate, it's ideal for cohogs to grow in this location. And so when we saw the results from the CRMC survey, you know, we can't deny the fact that there are these patchy high densities. That being said, it doesn't mean that the entire site looks like that, but the fact that there are these densities means that it is conducive to a good production of cohogs in that location. Does that answer your question, David?
Yes, it does. But just as a follow-up, and again, excuse my ignorance, if it were a two acre site and there were more pulls done, I mean, could it be that it's just such a small area that it was one spot that was fertile, but all the other, you know, spots in another 2 or 3 acre area would not be? Again, excuse my ignorance. I'm just trying to understand. You know, if it were a larger area, would we have similar results? You know.
Well, I'd like Ben to also provide feedback too, so I don't, you know, state anything against what he's trying to explain. But when you do these kinds of samplings, you try to do it as random as possible so that you get a good representation of what the site type is like. And so in this instance, you are at a disadvantage in the fact that it is a smaller area, but again, you're doing a sampling that is in the same proportion to the amount of area as you would at a larger site. So you're randomly getting that sampling, and it should be a representation of what that site suitability is in general. So I would like, Ben, if you have anything in addition to say about this, or?
Ben?
I mean, you know, this is, you know, most shellfish survey occurs in deeper water on larger sites, and we would do more square meters to cover that area. The randomization that we get from surveying from the boat, you know, a lot of that is just using the tongs and drifting over certain areas, taking a number of pulls in one area and going to another, and doing a couple pulls there. You know, what I did here was just kind of walk down the beach, and you know, just kind of randomly just chose transects to go across, and even on top of that, like I said, I wasn't pulling the rake the entire time. So I would take a pull and I take a few more steps back and take a pull and take a few more steps back, take a pull. So, you know, it was randomized in that way too. You know, the biggest difference here is what I was using is half the size of what we would normally use, being the tongs, as in what's covered in that area. So, yeah, and it was, and I would say, I've not heard or seen or would suspect commercial activity in this area. This application did receive one objection from a nearby landowner that did mention this is an area he uses to recreationally shellfish. And I have not observed, but I've certainly heard anecdotally that various spots along that shoreline are used for recreational shellfishing. And this site is already where it is now, the closest site to the shore in Dutch Island Harbor, and the proposed expansion is to be even closer.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Ben and Anna, for that response. Joe, I see your hand up, but I'm going to hold on. I'm going to come back to you. I'd like to first go to other members of the council who may have questions or comments, and then I will go back to you, Joe, after the council has an opportunity. Chris Ryan, did I see your hand up earlier? Yes, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bob. This is really a follow-on on Dave's question, and I don't know that I clearly heard what I was looking for regarding the science too, and this does relate to the differences between, say, a half-acre lot or a 2-acre lot or a 4-acre lot. Is part of the protocol, the CRMC or the DEM protocol for this kind of sampling require a number of transects or a number of square meters per acre? For example, Ben, you said you did 5 transects in this half-acre. So if you were to be sampling a 2-acre lease request, would you have done 20 transects? How do you equivalate the area sampled versus the size of the overall requested lease area? That's the question I have.
Ben?
Sure, that's a good question. You know, I sampled a 10-acre expansion in Ninigret, and I think we covered close to 20 square meters on that for that survey. So yeah, we definitely take a number of samples. You know, there's not a formula, if that's what you're looking for, that would be, you know, this many square meters covered for this size of a lot. But you know, some spots you go to and you start off doing a bunch of randomized samples, and you know, every one comes up with nothing. You know, sometimes you go to a place and you know, you keep going and you want to make sure, you know, at least the tongs are catching, and you catch a few, and then you realize, you know, there are quahogs here, and so you want to make sure, you know, what we really try to do mostly is cover the area, you know, proportionally, so that we have some idea of, you know, where the shellfish are. We don't always, like I said, we usually do it with the tongs, so it's not always in a direct transect. It's more maybe just a drift with the boat in different areas.
Okay, thank you. Understood.
Thanks for that question. Other questions or comments from the council? What I plan to do is see if there are any. I don't see any hands going up. If not, I'll go back to the applicant one more time, and then I'll look to the council for a motion. So again, the council will have another opportunity, but for now, since I see no hands up, I'll go back to the applicant. Joe Pinheiro, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify some things about what I just heard and what I said earlier. As far as that being like a small site, and the density would be a lot smaller if we were to apply for more acreage. So to kind of clarify that, we have a 2-acre site, 2.07 acre site there now, where we had a density survey done. Excuse me. And it was 0.3. It was really low, 0.3 per square meter, even maybe 0.03 per square meter. Something really low either way. If you average those two together, even at the high number 0.3, you get under 2 per square meter. So we're applying for a 50-foot expansion of our current site. If you take that whole site right there, get the density, it's under 2 per square meter, which would go right through SAP. If it's under 3, it usually just goes right through, no objection. Basically, if you deny us tonight, what it comes down to is we would have the option to come back and apply for more acreage. We applied for 3 or 4 acres with this little piece added to it. The density, we're going to come back in another year and we're going to come back to you guys and say, all right, the density's good. You can have the site. You know, that doesn't make sense. If you see what's going on in Rhode Island, it's the same exact thing. You would have found you would have dug the site. If we had applied for 4 acres, you would have dug the site, found 6 call hogs in his square meter on this site. And then he would have went out a little deeper and he would have found 0 through the whole site. So we would have found 6 or 10 call hogs through a 6-acre site. It doesn't, you know, I feel like we're following the program, the CRMC program, like the history of everything. I think it fits in with everything that's been approved already. And just the last thing I kind of like to add that I forgot to before was that I see this talked about all the time in these meetings, the shellfish meetings and the marine fisheries meetings, is that the fact that the call hogs, they come and go. You know, sometimes you get a low density and it's said almost every time. Well, just because there's a low density now, does that mean that there's not going to be a low density ever? And the consensus is that the call hogs, they come and go. You know, this council, the SAP council, everybody knows that one year you're going to find some call hogs. To shut us down because you found 30 call hogs after a year of going through this whole thing with, you know, Corona and everything else, just to find 30 call hogs, you know, in Rhode Island, to shut down an aquaculture site, that would be kind of what you're voting on tonight, you know. So I just really hope that you guys really take into consideration, you know, all the factors. Like I said, we had no objections. We had the one landowner, he didn't say that he recreational dug on the site. He said that he was a digger and he was looking for a buffer zone. And we do have a buffer zone there, 25 to 30 foot buffer from mean low tide. So I don't believe that we have any true objections at all on the whole site, from commercial diggers, from recreational diggers, nobody, from the view, nobody. So, I mean, hopefully you guys can take into consideration all the factors, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. We appreciate it as well. One point of clarification from me, and then one quick question, and then I'm going to go to the council for a motion. A point of clarification is that it's not the purview of this Rhode Island Marine Fishery Council to approve or not approve of your application. Tonight, this council is going to be rendering an advice to the CRMC, and it will be the CRMC, the Coastal Resources Management Council, that renders a final decision. So I just want to make that point of clarification. And I have one question, and that is, since these are animals that you plan to plant on the bottom without any equipment or cages, as I understand it, is it your intent to demarcate this expanded area, if approved, with buoys, and it would be understood that there shall be no recreational shell fishing within that buoyed area? Would that be the ramification of an approval, Joe?
That would be basically, yeah, the only restriction there. You can still kayak, swim, you know, you can go check it out, do all other kinds of recreation, but we see this as more kind of like a restoration site for the area where, you know, there's a lot of diggers in Jamestown, and the fact that nobody objected to it should really go to show you that there's other areas where people are digging in Jamestown, even really close to here. I mean, Jamestown's an island, so obviously there's just miles of shoreline, but just in this vicinity, there's a lot of areas where you can recreational dig. And this area, like I said, is going to restore, you know, if we plant a lot of clams here, obviously it's just going to be spewing out millions of seed. It's all over that shore. So any type of recreation that it would potentially take away from anybody, I mean, it's just going to seed that area to where it's just going to, you know, have a net positive, like exponentially. We're still 30 feet from mean low too, so we're going to have a lot of call hogs that migrate into what I like to call that golden line there, you know, just past mean low tide. When the winter those winter tide come in and you get that extra 20 feet of tide there, there's going to be a lot of call hogs right inside of that farm there that you can recreational dig. That, you know, like I said, it's going to be a net positive for everybody. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. Back to the council. Chris Ryan?
Thanks, Bob. Just before we go to a motion or a vote, could Ben or who's ever running the screen show us that lease area again with the proposed half acre and its prospective distance from the other active lease areas down there? I saw there was a figure, but I'd like to see it again before we finish this. I think there was so there was another figure that showed other lease areas. Yeah, that one there. Thank you. And could the Pinheiros show me which are the other areas that are controlled by the Pinheiros? Are they all the red
It's
ones?
just outside. No, we're just outside that small green area where it says Pinheiro. The little red line outside of that, that's us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And Ben, just for the record, these other areas indicated in red as approved, these are additional CRMC approved aquaculture lease sites that we're seeing here, Ben? Is that accurate?
Correct. Yeah. What you see, the other colored lines represent other phases of application review or applications that have been withdrawn. For instance, the Pinheiro site, if you can see it, is that smallest orange box near the shore there. The green box behind them is not an active site. The one that's directly offshore behind them, that is a withdrawn application. CRMC has encouraged the applicants to perhaps expand in other directions. That was something that came up in the PD.
Okay, well, thank you. So with that, let's go back to the full screen so we can always go back if any council member wants to, but I'd like to go back to this screen. Thank you, Nicole. And if there are any other questions, and I do see one, Katie Egan, go ahead.
I just have a couple of comments. Since Ben has taken over this position, the site assessment process has become way more transparent, which was an issue that we've had with the SAP in the past, kind of questionable methodologies. And but since Ben has come into this role, he's clearly and thoroughly described his process and using different gear that is appropriate for the bottom that he's sampling. And the panel is very happy with how he's been doing it and how he's kind of conveying it to us. So I think it's going a long way with becoming a more transparent, clear process for all of us. That being said, also the panel member who represents the recreational shellfishing community voted with the motion. So that's something to consider when we're voting. Also, we also asked the panel asked the applicant, would it be possible for him to expand instead of expanding shoreward, but to be going out into the deeper water, just because there is potential for recreational fishing with this density in this area that he's applying for. So just that's all things that I don't know if I made clear in the beginning, but something to consider.
Well, thank you very much for that. I don't see any other hands. So at this point, what I'd like to do is now move to a motion, and it should be in the form of a recommendation to the CRMC that the aquaculture activities proposed in this application, in this Pinheiro application, either are or are not consistent with competing uses engaged in the exploitation of marine fisheries. That is the purview of this Marine Fisheries Council, and it would therefore be appropriate for a motion to be put in that way. Would any member of the council like to make a motion? Jason, did I see some?
Yeah, I have a question first.
Sure, go ahead.
Just I've been looking at it. How shoal is the lease towards the shoreline there? What's the depth?
Ben, do you know that?
Well, I'll tell you, I went and did the survey at a low tide, and I wore my waders, and I didn't get wet. So it's chest height water, just below the top of my chest waders at the deepest point where I was sampling, and that was right up against the existing boundary line.
Because I didn't even think of that until Katie had said something. I'm wondering why, or if it would be an issue to move it seaward.
It was something that CRMC saw might be a better alternative to going shoreward. I think the applicants had different ideas.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm reluctant to get into a lot of back and forth unless any member of the council wants to seek further information from the applicant, for example, on that issue. It's your prerogative, but I also want to try to keep this as targeted as we can. Dave Monty?
I'd like to make a motion that this lease is in conflict with wild harvest, and the council should not recommend that it be approved.
Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Katie Egan. So moved by Dave Monty and seconded by Katie Egan. And Dave, if it's okay, I'm going to put it in the language that is essentially the obligatory language for this council to utilize, and that is to recommend to the CRMC that the aquaculture activities proposed in the application are not consistent with competing uses engaged in the exploitation of marine fisheries. I believe that's consistent with what you were making the motion to do, and there it is on the screen. Thank you, Nicole, for being so quick with this. So I'll read it just to be crystal clear, and that is to move to recommend to the CRMC that the Pinheiro aquaculture lease application number 2020-008-001 is not consistent with competing uses engaged in the exploitation of marine fisheries. Discussion on the motion. Would anyone from the council like to offer any comments regarding the motion that's before the council? Seeing no hands, is the council ready for the question? If so, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand and keep them up so we can do a count. 1, 2. I'm going to ask staff to help me here because I don't have the full screen up. So keep your hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4. I see Andy 4, Chris 5, Travis no. Okay, so 5 in favor, and I'm going to make sure we'll go back and check this. The 5 in favor I have are Chris Ryan, Katie Egan, Andy D'Angelo, Jason Jarvis, and Dave Monty. All opposed, one opposed, and that would be Travis Barrow. So I'm going to ask staff to check my math here, but I have 5 in favor, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 opposed, and the motion therefore passes 5-1. And it looks like Nicole concurs. Is there any, did I make sure I got that right? I think. Is there any council member that I misrepresented? I don't see any indication as such. So with that, the motion passes 5-1. We will forward that recommendation to the CRMC. The CRMC will take up this matter in due course. So thank you to the applicants. Thank you to the council members. Thank you to Ben Getch, who I know has to jump off for another meeting at 7, and we got you just with 3 minutes to spare, Ben. So, and thank you to Katie and the SAP members. I thought that was a very good, engaged discussion. And with that, we will move on to the next agenda item, and that's item 7, and that involves a series of proposed regulation amendments. I'm going to ask either John or Pete to sort of tee this up. And before we jump into these issues, first I just want to note that for a number of these, not all of them, but for a number of these, the recommendation is status quo, and we received little, if any, public comment. My inclination is to go through those fairly quickly. I'll do the standard process of seeing if there's a motion and a second and any objection, hearing none. And I'll try to move quickly, but I don't want to preclude any comment or any discussion on any of these issues. So please, if you have any interest on any of these issues and I'm moving too quickly, stop me and I'll slow down. I also know that Jason McNamee is going to be speaking briefly at the beginning on the overall management program for recreational black sea bass, scup, and summer flounder. So we'll go to Jason before we go to each of those items. With that, I guess I'll look to, well, why don't we go to Jason first? Jason, if you don't mind, why don't you offer your perspectives, as I understand you were planning to, on those issues, and then we'll go into them individually. Jason?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, everybody, and hi, haven't seen you in a while. I wanted to just sort of let you know, we had to do some atypical things this go around with regard to the notice, and so we wanted to just be forthright with you and let you know what was going on there. So in particular for summer flounder, I don't know if anybody proposed anything for scup, but certainly for summer flounder and black sea bass, we had a number of proposals. They were, you know, perfectly fine proposals. In a normal year, we would have, you know, brought those forward, vetted them with the technical committee, and gone through all of the motions, which we've always done. We've always tried to have a good, open, and fair process. For this year, and it was in fact the case last year as well, we didn't have a lot of scope by which to do any sorts of conservation equivalency or to check any of these alternate proposals that were brought forward to us. Specifically, like examples are moving the black sea bass start, you know, about a month earlier, and those sorts of things. And the reason for that is we're in kind of a weird situation with these jointly managed species where there is a lot going on with regard to the recreational data and you know, how things were allocated. There's all sorts of amendments going on simultaneously. And so the guidance that we received, both from NOAA and from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and because it's jointly managed, the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council as well, was that basically we had status quo was our only option. We've gone way over both for summer flounder and black sea bass, the allowed biological catch. In a normal year, what that would mean is we would have to take a big reduction. So we would have been talking about reductions and things like that. For the past 2 years, they've allowed us to stay at status quo. And they do allow for very minor adjustments. For instance, I think it's like New Jersey, you know, they like to start their season on a Saturday. So the date, you know, will change by a day or two. They still have to do a conservation equivalency and take days off the back end of the season. But, you know, we're talking about very minor adjustments. So long story short, with the alternatives that were put forward to us, we deemed them to be a little too significant for this year to meet that status quo guidance that we received. And not a little bit, they were much too significant to sort of meet those measures. And so we made the determination to not notice those to be fair and to, you know, not have people think that those were options for them to comment on. And so that's a lot longer than I had intended to be. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chair, and happy to take any questions on that, but we just wanted to be forthright with you to let you know why those other alternative approaches weren't noticed. That is why, and it's because they weren't going to be viable proposals for us this year with the federal fishery management plan guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I think Jason's going to be here throughout the meeting, so if there's any species-specific questions, he'll be available to address them. But any general questions for Jason before we jump in? Seeing no hands, John, the floor is yours to kind of walk us through, or Pete, whoever's going to handle this, to begin the roll through of these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That'll be me. Once we get the slideshow up, we can begin. All right, so for the first species under consideration is for recreational black sea bass management for 2021. There are no noticed proposed changes. The only option here is status quo, which the division supports.
Thank you, John. Any questions for John or Jason? Seeing no hands, there is a hand, Dave Monty, go ahead.
Are we voting on each of these, Bob?
Well, I think we should, yes. The answer is we should. So I was gonna try to roll through them pretty quickly. But again, I don't want to forestall any discussion or any alternative suggestions. I just wanted to see how the council wants to move forward. So it's really your call, Dave. Go
So
ahead.
I didn't know if we were going to review black sea bass, vote on it, review Scup, vote on it, or.
Well, we can always bundle them together. That's the prerogative of the council. Your call, Dave. Would you like to vote on them individually?
No. I did have a comment on black sea bass, just to want to make the council aware. As Jason mentioned, the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers did have a proposal to start the season early. I think this is the 5th year in a row. We understand that it couldn't be heard. I believe that Massachusetts did submit a conservation equivalency proposal, and we were a little disheartened by that, because we felt that we had some good grounds for ours, and I totally understand Jason and everyone, but it was disappointing on the species.
Understood, and it's hard for me to because I don't see everybody the way this is configured, so that's okay. Please jump in if anyone has a question or a comment. I'll do my best to see if any of the council members are indicating that they have a question or comment. I see none. So with that, I'll ask for a motion regarding recreational black sea bass. Andy, D'Angelo? You need to unmute yourself, Andy, first. This is painful watching Andy try to figure out how to unmute himself. But hopefully he'll get it.
Got it.
Got it.
All right. Sorry about that. Just kind of a comment, though. I know saltwater anglers are trying to get the sea bass open earlier, which I kind of agree with if we can do something so we don't lose the back end of it. So
right.
That's been the problem. So if we can come out some way of opening up a little bit earlier, we're still giving us something at the other end. I will be well agreed with that in the future here. So anyway,
Thanks,
I'd like to make a motion if I can, just that we are status quo.
Thank you. Is there a seconded by, that was Chris. Okay, so moved by Andy D'Angelo and seconded by Chris Ryan to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for recreational black sea bass in 2021. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing no hands, this is how I'm gonna handle all these issues where I don't anticipate any objections, but please, if you do have an objection, make it clear. Is there any objection to the motion? In other words, instead of doing a vote, I'll just say, is there any objection? Raise your hand if you do, and I see no hands. Therefore, the motion is adopted unanimously, and the motion is approved by consent. Thank you, Nicole, better put. And we're on to the next issue, and John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The next issue is 2021 recreational scup management. There are no proposed changes and the division supports status quo.
Any thoughts or comments on recreational scup management? Dave Monty?
Motion made to approve the status quo recommendation.
Is there a second? Who was that?
Chris.
Chris, thank you, Chris. Moved by Dave Monty and seconded by Chris Ryan to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for recreational scup management in 2021. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing no hands, is there any objection to approving the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion passes by consent, is approved by consent, and we're on to the next issue, which I believe might be summer flounder. Yes, John?
The next issue is 2021 recreational summer flounder management. There are no proposed changes and the division supports status quo.
I think we might have had one public comment on this. Obviously the council has had a chance to review all the public comments. So, for what it's worth, there were a few comments in the record on some of these, summer flounder being one. I just want to make sure that's noted for the record. Any questions or comments? Would anyone like to make a motion regarding Andy D'Angelo?
I'd like to make a motion that we stay status quo with summer flounder.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Jason Jarvis, moved by Andy D'Angelo and seconded by Jason Jarvis to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for recreational summer flounder in 2021. Any further discussion on the motion? If not, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent. As soon as Nicole records that on the screen, there we go, beautiful. We're on to the next issue, which is recreational striped bass.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'd like to pass it off to Nicole Costa. She's going to give an update on circle hooks for the council.
Great. Nicole?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to give the council a brief update and let you know that the Striped Bass Management Board at ASMFC did meet in February and they discussed circle hooks. They have formed an ad hoc committee that is going to be revisiting the definition of bait for circle hooks, along with what to do about bycatch of striped bass when targeting other species. And in the meantime, they did approve an exemption for tube and worm rigs for the next 2 years. And so right now the division has planned to do a direct final rule for the tube and worm exemption, along with any other modifications that the board comes up with. The board is due to meet in March. The meeting has not been set yet, but we are expecting it to be in the middle to end of March, at which time we will go through a direct final rule process to put those regs into place. And hopefully it'll be the end of April, but definitely by May 1 that those new rules will be in regulation.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Questions for Nicole on that circle hook issue? Seeing no hands, John, do you want to just summarize the status quo proposal? I guess.
Yeah, sure. There are no proposed changes for 2021 recreational striped bass management, and the division supports status quo.
Thank you. And I know, again, there were some comments in the record, a lot of folks sort of understanding it is what it is, with the hope that maybe particularly that maximum size might drop out in the future. Again, just noting what I read in the record. Dave Monty?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Nicole and the division for, in part, certainly advocating to get the circle hook issue cleared up with tube and worm. And I understand to a certain extent the consideration of natural baits, not considering pork rind a natural bait, I think is on the table too. And I hope it is. So I just thank everyone for that effort, because it's something certainly that most recreational anglers were advocating for. That said, I'd like to make a motion to approve this status quo striped bass recommendation.
Thank you. Is there a second to that? Seconded by Andy D'Angelo, moved by Dave Monty and seconded by Andy D'Angelo to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for recreational striped bass management in 2021. Any discussion on the motion? Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent, and we're on to commercial general category striped bass management. This has a little bit more zest to it. John?
Yeah, sure. So the next species is 2021 commercial striped bass general category management. As you can see, we have 4 proposed one status quo and 3 proposed changes. The proposed changes change the start date, and one of them also adds a closed day. The division has no preference and could manage any of these proposals.
Thank you, John. Questions for John? So there are 4 proposals for the council to think through and come to terms on with regard to a recommendation. relatively minor differences between them. And there are some comments on the record pertaining to them. I'd look to the council for either questions or comments or potentially a motion on this.
Chris here, just a question for John.
Go ahead.
About option 2, or any of the fellow council members that might have the closed days. Having 4 closed days in a week sounds like something that people might be against, particularly people who are trying to sell fish. So I just wonder, were there any comments that were, specifically opposed to that, adding a 4th day? That seems an unusual thing to close it for 4 days.
John, are you aware of whether there are any comments on the record pertaining to that particular proposal?
I believe there are comments in support of keeping it at 3 days out. I'm not aware of any comment on getting rid of Thursday, though. I'd have to look through it.
Okay. Thank you.
Dave Monte.
I'd be interested, Jason Jarvis, I'm wondering if you have any particular feelings about these industry proposals, or any vibe that you've heard of support for anyone in particular.
Jason?
Well, most that I've heard from want to go with status quo. One of the only comments I did hear, and it comes from guys that, fish the island and fish the South Shore commercially, is we run out of the quota pretty much before the end of July or August. And then in late October, we end up getting whatever's left over from the fish traps. And one of the comments that I had gotten from someone was, there any way that we could get the overage or underage from the fish traps before October or November? I mean, because by that time, these fish are gone. For the guys down here, I mean, you can get them on the island maybe, but by that time, they're already in Montauk or farther south. But besides that, I think everyone else I've heard wants to stay with status quo. I mean, the season ends up being pretty short. I think we end up with maybe 5 total weeks of landings for the year.
Thanks for that, Jason. And we can maybe circle back to that issue about the floating fish trap. It comes up next on the agenda, and perhaps staff could weigh in on that. It seems like that would be the right place to have that discussion. But thank you for that answer to Dave's question. Any other questions from Dave Monte?
I'd like to make a motion that we approve the status quo option 1.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Seconded by, I'm sorry, I saw Katie's hand go up, so I'm gonna recognize Katie Egan as the second. So moved by Dave Monte and seconded by Katie Egan to recommend adoption of status quo for commercial striped bass management. Are there any, I mean, typically we don't go to the public, but I do know this is sort of an unusual situation with these Zoom meetings. And I do know there are at least some folks present tonight who, if you have a comment specific to the motion, I'll give you the opportunity to weigh in right now. Would anyone attending tonight's meeting from the public like to speak to the motion? If so, please raise your hand. And if I don't see any, I see one hand up. Who would that be?
We have Joe Macari's hand up. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Joe, go ahead. As soon as you unmute, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm Joe Macari. I'm commercial rod and reel fisherman, and I'm in support of status quo. I think most people are. It's worked out very good the last few years. There's an even split on who catches fish, as far as the guys in the Bay and the guys on the South Shore, Watch Hill and Block Island, Newport. So I think that's it's worked. Why mess with it? Seeing it's worked good the last couple of years with the amount of quota we got. If we get more quota at some time in the future, depending on Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Council, then we can revisit it. But I think status quo works for most guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joe. Appreciate that input. Seeing no other hands, is the council ready for the question? If so, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. And please keep them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's a unanimous 6-0. Thank you for that. And next is commercial floating fish trap striped bass. And perhaps, John, after you tee this up, maybe staff could weigh in on the question that or issue that Jason Jarvis brought forward. John?
Yeah, sure. So we have no proposed changes, and the division can support, can manage status quo. And, we have heard about the rollover of the striped bass floating fish trap. I'm going to pass it off to Nicole Costa, who's our striped bass staff member.
Nicole?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I will note our rollovers, we do have a process in place. We've gone back and forth over the years of whether to have a specific date in regulation or not to have a date. The most recent was to remove that date a few years ago. So we do have the ability to roll over allocation from the floating fish traps to the general category in consultation with the floating fish trap operators. So last year we did that, took advantage of that process. We rolled over 20,000 pounds on September 28th. And while it is still a little bit late in the season, the end of September, we start getting bad weather and storms. We definitely understand that, but it is very difficult when the fish traps are in the water and actively fishing, and they have historically gotten a fall run of fish. It's really difficult for us to take that allocation away when they're still actively fishing. We did about 4 or 5 years ago do that, and we did an early rollover in the beginning of September. And just a couple weeks after that, the floating fish traps got a huge run of fish, and they weren't able to harvest it because all of their quota was rolled over. It created quite a difficult problem. So we make every attempt to strike a balance between the allocation and coordinating that with the floating fish trap operators. We thought we did relatively well by doing it in September of last year. In previous years, it has been later in October, November. We'll continue to work with industry on that. We'll be mindful of it throughout the season. If for some reason all the floating fish trap operators took their gear out of the water earlier in the season, we would definitely take advantage of that earlier.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. And I see Jason nodding, so it looks like he got his question answered. Thank you, Nicole. Back to the council, and I'd look to the council for a recommendation on this issue. Would anyone like to make a motion? Jason?
Yeah, make a motion that we keep the commercial floating fish trap management at status quo.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Chris will second.
Thank you. Moved by Jason Jarvis and seconded by Chris Ryan to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for commercial floating fish trap striped bass management in 2021. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent, and we're on to recreational Tautog. John?
So for recreational Tautog management, 2021, we have no proposed changes, and the division does support status quo. This was a similar situation as black sea bass, where we did get some recreational proposals that we did not go forward because we could not coordinate with our partner in the region, Massachusetts.
Thanks, John. Questions for John on recreational Tautog? Dave Monty?
There was a proposal from the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers. Actually, it was a very, I thought, conservation-minded proposal, where this has been an outstanding fishery for private recreational anglers and the for-hire industry. Particularly the last 3 or 4 years has been outstanding. And there is concern in the recreational community that we are taking large females. So the proposal, just to give the council an idea, and you probably saw it, but it was to limit the amount of large fish that are taken. And I'm sure we're going to be coming back with that proposal next year. We were certainly a little disappointed that it wasn't able to get on the table since it was even more conservation minded. I understand John's point about our partner, but moving forward, we're going to be, I'm sure, making that proposal once again. That said, I would like to make a motion to accept the Tautog status quo regulation before us.
I was muted. Is there a second to that motion?
Travis.
Travis, I'm sorry. My fingers are not as nimble. Thank you, Travis, for calling out. And I saw, Andy, your hand up. I just got to you late. So I'll go with motion by Mr. Monty, seconded by Mr. Barrow, to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for 2021 recreational Tautog management. Any further discussion on the motion? Jason McNamee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to, I appreciated Dave Monty's comment. What I wanted to offer, in addition to what John offered, is one of the reasons we didn't want to do anything with Tautog for this year is they're in the midst of an assessment. So we're going to have, I think, next year, some new assessment information. So what we didn't want to do is make a move this year and then have to make potentially a subsequent move next year. So I just wanted to offer that additional piece of information as to why we kind of stayed status quo this year, anticipating a new assessment, which should come out next year.
Thank you for that, Jay. Any further comments or questions on the motion? Seeing no hands, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent, and we're on to commercial Tautog management. And I'll just go to John first. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, sure. So there are no proposed changes, and the division supports status quo, similar to recreational. And thank you, Jay, for mentioning the assessment as well. We didn't have any proposed changes at workshop. I'm aware that one has come in as a comment. We got a clear indication from Massachusetts they were not looking to make any changes this year. So we are here at status quo.
Thank you, John. And I believe your reference to the comment might have been Bob Morris's, who did submit a written comment, and very much appreciated. And Bob, you did indicate at the beginning of this meeting that you'd like to make sure that your comments are before the council. Would you like to address the council at this time, Bob? It looks like you do, so go ahead, unmute yourself and please address the council.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're all good.
Well, I guess to start with, the meetings I went to dealing with the lobby of the Tautog, where they found huge amounts of lobby. The highest concentrations in all the areas was just north of Communicate Point and a little south of the Fields Point sewage discharge. That, I think, is probably the biggest problem with the lobby not making it. Then you have the cormorants, which are all along the same habitat, where we're not seeing the cunners, we're not seeing chargers, we're not seeing little Tautog. So the fish, I believe, is really getting stressed out here. And really the name of the game with all the fisheries is survival of the egg. That's how you put numbers into the fisheries, through the eggs. And if you got a big Tautog with massive amounts of eggs, it's only, I think, logical that you should release it. You know, they have other fisheries like the grouper, like the striped bass, where they're doing this. And I think this is a good way of going in the future. And there is a better marketability for a slot where, you know, I mean, this is a proposal which I was hoping to take to a workshop. I'm very busy in the fall. I hope that we could get something done sooner. I am kind of confused why we have to work with another state when we're actually, we're not increasing our effort, we're actually decreasing it. And why we have to go to Massachusetts and work with them, and where this program could fall apart. Here we are, you know, with conservation equivalency. I mean, we're really under it. And I can see the purpose if we were going over it. we wanted more quota, or we wanted somehow to not have the conservation measure decreased, but increased, then I could see it. But here we're decreasing the conservation effort so that there's more fish available for all. I'm a little sketchy on that one. Anyways, that was my proposal in general. There's other things that I hear from other fishermen more than my personal conviction about chlorinated byproducts and what they're doing, and they're not being at all looked at to the entire fisheries. I mean, you can bring bay scallops out of the bay. You can bring the green crab out of these bays where they're catching them in the salt ponds. Put them in the little Narragansett Bay where they're all worried about. Well, you got the Wesley discharge there. Then there are no green crabs there. And you're finding out wherever these discharges are, there's no green crabs. So, they're using other chemicals besides chlorine now at the end of the pipe. When the chlorine's coming out, and who knows what kind of masses, they add sodium bisulfate, which I wish we could just get a tank of water and test before we destroy, because I feel that we don't have any research. We don't put the larvae in a tank of water and add the chemicals and say, hey, wow, having a real terrible effect on crustaceans. I mean, the green crab probably could be one of the major food sources of a tautog. But I think the foundation is where we got to start, and all things will come back in big numbers. The bay scallop, I could take a bay scallop out of those ponds, bring it up near those discharges, and they're going to die. So what's that tell you? There's something wrong with the water quality. But anyways, the bottom line is the tautog, I feel, are really going to get hit hard with pollution, with predators, and give them a chance and get some eggs in that water. And that's a proposal that I hope, and as I said, that's my personal one. There's others that go along with that, but more what I'm hearing on the waterfront, the fishermen are talking about a lot of other things, such as tags. Why, if 90% of the fish are being caught by the recreational sector, why aren't they tagging the fish? There's a lot of things that can come up at a tautog meeting. And of course, we had this pandemic this year, so it kind of made things rough for anybody to really get together. And I mean, there's a lot of people. They're not competent and they're not knowledgeable of really how to run a computer and get on Zoom. And, so there's a lot of stuff out there when you really can't find out until you have a sit-down meeting with one-on-one in an audience. So anyways, that's basically what I promote and I hope to do. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob, and we really appreciate your input. Your comments are on the record. I did hear you indicate that perhaps a workshop approach might be ideal to kind of vet the various issues that you're interested in, and they do seem to be multifaceted, and all points well taken. Would you be comfortable rolling that forward into next year's cycle and bringing your comments forward into the workshop process next year?
Hey, Bob, you're asking me, do I feel like it should have been yesterday? Yes, it should have been done yesterday, as soon as possible, ASAP. You can do emergencies on some things. I don't know, why not? If we find out, especially in assessments that you're going to be doing quite recent in time here, that you find that there is a collapse happening, and maybe you should jump on the bandwagon right away and get something done as soon as possible.
Got it. Well, thank you for that. And yes, as you say, it does map in well with the upcoming assessment. It does seem like Tautog is going to be on a front burner, commercial and recreational, as we move into the next cycle. So thank you for that. And with that, we're back to what we have before us tonight, what the council has before you tonight, and that is a status quo option. Would anyone from the council like to ask any questions, make any comments, or offer a motion? Jason Jarvis?
Yeah, I'd like to, again, thank Bob for what he said. And I think this has been on the mind of a lot of people. And it goes back to what Dave Monty had said as well. A good example is down on the South Shore here. I mean, because of the pandemic, there were a lot more recreational fishermen. Combine that with social media and just this overwhelming ability to get information on fishing spots, a lot of people are targeting large blackfish. And I think we are going to eventually see a pretty serious problem. And the sad part is because these fish take so long to mature, we might not see it right away. But that is my concern, is that, I mean, something Bob had said, and it's a much broader area here, is that we have this antiquated system where we regulate species, and most of the fish we're allowed to keep are spawners, breeders, larger fish. And I think at some point we've got to figure out, through the scientific community and in collaboration with fishermen, like what is the best answer for this? Because blackfish are one of my favorite fish to catch recreationally. They are just a lot of fun. And after years of catching fish that were good size, I no longer keep a fish over 5 pounds. They all go back. I can't do it. I've gill netted for them. Biggest one we ever threw back was 19 pounds. And the captain just looked at me and said, well, that's older than you, throw it back. I think we maybe even an educational thing going on somehow, some way, between recreational efforts, commercial efforts, to at least educate people what a female blackfish looks like. And then also, just even if it's just a gentleman's agreement with people, throw these bigger fish back until we do get to the point where there's a new assessment and we can get some concrete, work done. But I mean, that's what I got to say to that. I mean, they don't seem to be in trouble yet, but with the pressure I saw on those fish last year, they could be in trouble really fast.
Yeah, thanks. Jason McNamee, if you don't mind, can you just weigh in with a sense of how you see things playing out with Tautog management this year, given the concerns that have been raised tonight? Do you view the concerns as valid and ones that may well be addressed in the upcoming management cycle?
So I absolutely think they're valid. I think, Tautog in particular, I agree with, I think it was Bob who said, sort of compared it to like a grouper. They're our version of a grouper. And they've had successful slot limit management for the grouper complex down south. So I like what you guys are talking about. I'm thinking about, so we'll get some information from the assessment, and that'll help us, kind of understand where we're at. But the new management regime, where we're in a region with Massachusetts, so we do need to work with them, and so it just takes a little bit of time. So I think we can kind of take this. I'm not sure if Nicole Aries is on the webinar here or not, but we can kind of, tuck these ideas in the back of our mind and start to talk about this with our colleagues in Massachusetts, thinking about slot limits, and regardless of the assessment outcome, maybe it's something we want to do anyways. So we'll start thinking about it and working through some of the complicated management aspects of that, and appreciate the discussion. It's a good one.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? If not, I'd entertain a motion for 2021 commercial Tautog management. Anyone like to make a motion?
Yes.
Chris Ryan?
Yes, just before I make the motion, I just wanted to kind of jump on what Bob and Jason and Jason were talking about. I have to agree that, I think these slot limits where you protect large breeding fish is a general good practice for us to be looking into as we move down the road in fisheries management. So with that, I'll make a motion that we accept the status quo as proposed.
Thank you, Chris. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Andy D'Angelo. So moved by Chris Ryan and seconded by Andy D'Angelo to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for 2021 commercial Tautog management. Any further discussion on the motion? Any objections to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent, and we're on to recreational bluefish. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For 2021 recreational bluefish management, there are no proposed changes and the division supports status quo.
Thank you, John. Any questions for John on recreational bluefish? Seeing no hands, would anyone like to make a motion on recreational bluefish? Dave Monty?
I'd like to make a motion to accept the status quo recreational bluefish regulation before us.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Jason Jarvis. So moved by Dave Monty and seconded by Jason Jarvis to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for 2021 recreational bluefish management. Any further discussion on the motion? Any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent, and we're on to commercial bluefish. John?
Sure. So for commercial 2021 bluefish management, there are no proposed changes and the division supports status quo.
Any questions for John regarding commercial bluefish? If not, would anyone like to make a motion pertaining to commercial bluefish?
Motion.
Dave Monty? Yeah.
Motion made to approve the option 1 status quo for commercial bluefish.
Thank you. Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second, Chris.
Thank you. So moved by Dave Monty, seconded by Chris Ryan to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for 2021 commercial bluefish management. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing no hands, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent. And I think we just have 3 more to go. The next would be commercial Menhaden. John?
Thank you. For 2021 commercial Menhaden management, there are no proposed changes and the division supports status quo.
Thank you. Any questions for John pertaining to commercial Menhaden management in 2021? If not, would anyone like to make a motion pertaining to commercial Menhaden in 2021? Do I see here? Looking for
Sure. I
Tony?
make a motion. Yep. I make a motion to recommend status quo.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Travis Barrow. So moved by Katie Egan and seconded by Travis Barrow to recommend to the director adoption of status quo for 2021 commercial Menhaden management. Any further discussion on the motion? Any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent. And here comes sand lance. John.
Yeah, sure. So this is a new species for management consideration. The idea here is to get some baseline rules out ahead of a potentially emerging fishery. The proposal is to have a possession limit of 200 pounds per vessel per day for sand lance.
Thank you, John. I'm going to ask, just because I'm darn curious, do we know of any commercial harvest of sand lance to date? Just curious.
The division is not aware of any Rhode Island commercial harvest of sand lance.
Okay, so this is a proactive move to put a management regime in place. Thank you. Do any council members have any questions for John? If not,
Yeah, Chris does.
Chris, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so I guess it's related to your question, Bob, and that is, other than, using them for bait or imitating them for bait, what is the commercial use of sand lance? Does somebody in the department or division can give us a little bit more information about that before we go ahead with a motion and a vote?
John, do you have a?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'm going to give it to my colleague, Connor McManus. He has been tracking the sand lance management.
Connor?
Thank you, John and Mr. Chair. So I'll first preface that the sand lance recommendations proposed here also are what is used in Massachusetts. As John has indicated, we have not had any reported sand lance landings for Rhode Island to date. The general consensus with sand lance is that it's a oily, lipid-rich forage fish like herring, like mackerel. In other areas around the globe that have had some of these forage fish species decline, harvest pressure has shifted onto them and have developed major commercial fisheries. So places like in England and Ireland, in the North Sea, Celtic Sea, that's been pretty prevalent in there. And now they're running into major concerns, not just from the stock status for sand lance, but then also it's a major prey item for most other commercially and recreationally significant species. So like in the Northwest Atlantic here, species like cod, tunas and such prey on sand lance. So oftentimes they're the crux of many of these coastal ecosystems that people have that have garnered a lot of focus on trying to make sure to sustain these various ecosystems like Stellwagen Bank, like Jeffrey's Ledge, and similar to Menhaden, similar ideas of trying to use an ecosystem-based management approach towards sustaining these areas as well as the constituents that they support. It should be noted too that what we're proposing is not only just a mirror for Massachusetts regs, but also there's been major push from the Mid-Atlantic Council, Fisheries Management Council, and the New England Fisheries Management Council in preserving sand lance to recognize its role in the ecosystem and supporting other commercial and recreational fisheries. So sand lance is part of the Mid-Atlantic Council's Forage Fish Omnibus Plan, which has specific guidelines of total allowable catch for a data limited set of species, including sand lance. And the New England Fisheries Management Council prohibits landing sand lance from federal waters in the northern region here, unless specified in some scientific permit or vessel or gear exemption list. Again, this is, as John noted, this is kind of taking that ecosystem-based management approach, and the limit is intended to try to allow smaller scale fisheries, subsistence fisheries to continue. So it's trying to not prohibit what might be operating at a smaller level, but it's just trying to help alleviate concerns that with other forage fish species in decline, that the effort is not entirely shifted on the sand lance, which is again serving such an important role for the ecosystem. There's also concern that the species suffers from localized depletion. So it's because of their, as their name would suggest, because they favor these sandy habitats, they're pretty easy to fish down, as other research has shown in the North Atlantic. And the big problem that we face with them is that they're what we would consider a data limited species. So there isn't very much information we have on them for their stock structure, their growth, their maturity. So it's somewhat proactive in terms of the management proposed here, but it's also in an effort to try and better understand their biology and what's actually sustainable before being reactive to large-scale developed fishery, not just for us, but then also with our counterparts and collaborators in Mass, New England Fisheries Management Council in the Mid. So I'm happy to take other questions too on this.
Thank you, Connor, for such a thorough answer. I appreciate it.
Great. Other questions, comments? If not, would anyone like to make a motion? Andy D'Angelo?
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion. For a change, they're closing the door before the horse got out, so it's a good thing. I'd like to make a motion that possession limit for sand lance is 200 pounds per vessel per day.
Thank you for that. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Chris Ryan and Jason Jarvis. I heard Chris first, so sorry, but I appreciate that motion and seconded. So move to recommend to the director adoption of the 2021 sand lance possession limit as proposed. Motion by Mr. D'Angelo, seconded by Mr. Ryan. Discussion on the motion. If seeing no hands, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent, and we're on to the final regulatory item. John?
Yeah, sure. So this is a Midwater trawl gear prohibition. It is basically coming into federal consistency with the federal rule, which has been enacted with Amendment 8 to the Atlantic Herring Fishery Management Plan. It bans the use of midwater trawl gear within 12 miles of the shore, including the 3 miles, which is state waters. This is us coming into, making a complementary rule with the federal plan.
Thank you. Is this a requirement, John, that this be adopted, or is it just a matter of good practice being consistent with the federal program?
It is not a requirement because the federal rule does go all the way to shore. It is basically providing another informational outlet for folks that might be fishing in state waters.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for John on this proposal? Seeing no hands, would anyone like to make a motion?
I'd like to make a motion.
Dave?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the Midwater trawl gear prohibition as outlined here.
Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Jason Jarvis. So moved by Dave Monte and seconded by Jason Jarvis to recommend to the director adoption of the 2021 Midwater trawl gear prohibition as proposed. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing no hands, any objection to the motion? Oh, I see one hand raised. Bob Morris. Bob Morris, go ahead. Your floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking like the heron. These guys go midwater trawling for heron, so it's going to be outlawed in these areas. Is that what I'm hearing here?
So they've enacted a rule for the Atlantic herring management plan that there's no use of midwater trawl gear within 12 miles of the shore. So regardless of whether we put this in or not, it's already been banned. This is just a complimentary move.
Well, I wasn't aware of that. Wow. It's, I remember years ago they were coming, every year is different. It was way back in the 60s and 70s. They were coming in the bay and it was really not that much off of Block Island. They were all being pushed into the lower shoal water. Yeah, well, that's something. I didn't think that would, well, I don't know. I haven't fisherman, so I can't really say too much, but I'm surprised at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Any further comments on the motion before the council? Seeing no hands, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no hands, the motion is approved by consent, and that, I believe, completes our regulatory agenda for tonight. Thank you very much. I believe we have just a couple of additional items on the agenda. Next is the Rhode Island Saltwater Recreational Fishing License Program Report. John Lake, I think you have a sort of modified version of this for tonight's agenda. The floor is yours.
Sure, it's just basically letting you guys know it's going to be on the agenda of your next meeting. The report has been written. I'm setting up a meeting with our recreational stakeholder group. Didn't want to rush it. I'll take the heat on this one. I usually initiate that about 2 weeks prior to when I actually did. I didn't want to rush the folks that vet the report with me, and we don't have as heavy an agenda for the May meeting anyways. So it'll be fine then. There's no time constraint on when we present it to the council. It is in your pack though, if you care to look at it early.
I was muted. Yes, so the draft report is in the council packet. The council is obviously welcome to review and offer any comments on it. In the meantime, John will be vetting it with the recreational community, and then it'll be back before the council for consideration and adoption at the May meeting. With that, are there any questions of John? Seeing none, we're on to our last item, and that is the Rhode Island Marine Fishery Council Annual Report. I'm the one listed here, so I'll just say that I want to thank Pete Duhamel, who I'm sure is on this meeting call. Yes, he is, who did, I think, an excellent job teeing it up. This is a process that we began, I don't know, a few years ago, reporting out. It's actually a requirement, so we stepped up to the plate and began meeting our requirement a few years ago. And I'm always impressed with the report. I always find myself thinking when I read through it, it's incredible how much work this council gets done over the course of just 4 or 5 meetings a year. And I do think Pete did an excellent job summarizing all of the actions taken by the council, all the issues that came before the council. And the report is a nice codification of that. And what we do after having it approved by this council tonight, if you're so inclined, is to then submit it to the Rhode Island General Assembly so that they're kept apprised on all the good work that you all do. So with that, are there any questions or comments on the draft report that is in your meeting materials? Seeing none, is there, I think this would be appropriate, and that would be a motion to approve the report for submittal to the General Assembly. Would anyone like to make that motion? Dave Monte? And Travis Barrow seconds. So moved by Dave Monte and seconded by Travis Barrow to approve the Rhode Island, the RIMFC Annual Report for 2020. This is our prior year, so it's for 2020, for submittal to the General Assembly. Let's do this. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. And it's unanimous. Thank you very much. And again, thank you. I always feel like this report is a great way to sort of acknowledge the good work, and thank you all for your contributions to marine fisheries management in Rhode Island. It's well reflected in that report. With that, we are down to any other matters to come before the council. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to bring before the council? Seeing no hands, is there any objection to adjourning for this evening? Before we adjourn, it's always nice to make sure we're aware of when the next meeting is. We've already referred to May. Can somebody indicate whether we have a date certain, or is it just going to be sometime in May?
Yep. Hey, Bob, May 3rd. We'll have a hearing in April and follow up the council on May 3rd. Might be a direct final rule proposal in there. I'll let you know when that happens.
Very good. So mark your calendars for May 3rd. And thank you all again. It was another great meeting, and we're adjourned. Good night. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.